Are any of you excited that school's back in session? The kids are back in school. Well, I teach 8th grade, and one thing that I noticed right before we went to break, and then especially this past week, so I teach them math, and their English teacher gave them The Hobbit to read as their book for the next month or so, and they came into class. They all had their copy of The Hobbit, and they were like, "Man, he's making us read this whole book. Oh, this guy's the worst." And they were so complaining, and it was terrible. But then I noticed something this week. I couldn't get them to focus on math because they were all sneaking The Hobbit under their desk, like reading the chapters like ahead that they were supposed to. I was so confused. I'm like, what are you guys doing? You were complaining that you didn't like it. And they're like, "No, we still don't like it." Like trying to read it. And it shows just what a powerful story that is. Many people obviously love The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. But I was thinking about that as we approach this tribe of Zebulun. Probably no one has done a lot of studies in this room on the tribe of Zebulun. Maybe you have. But it's one of the more lesser known tribes. And I was thinking about The Hobbit, how Tolkien wrote this story about this huge, magnificent world, and with wizards and elves and dragons and trolls and all this stuff. And he made the center of his story as insignificant a figure as possible, this hobbit that's just minding his own business, this little person that is kind of meaningless in this world. But he takes him and he gives him significant meaning and purpose in his story. And he does that in The Lord of the Rings as well. And it made me think of this, how we're going to see God take this seemingly insignificant tribe and give it a lot of honor and a lot of prestige and really bless this tribe as we go through this text. So if you remember, we're reading through Joshua, and we're in chapter 19. So this is Joshua 19, and we're starting on verse 10. So we've talked about the tribe of Benjamin, the tribe of Simeon, and now we're going to get into the tribe of Zebulun. So verse 10, "Now the third lot came up for the sons of Zebulun according to their families, and the territory of their inheritance was as far as Sarid." So that's going to be our starting point. And I have our handy-dandy map up here. So if you remember, let's see if this works. This is where Benjamin was. And then we had, and I'll do this one over here for you guys, Simeon down here. And now we are talking about Zebulun right there. And that's the border that I'm going to be reading in our text in Joshua chapter 19. So it's not going to be up there. You can look at the map, and certainly you know where all these places are in Israel, so you'll be able to follow the whole border. Maybe not, but we'll read this together. So I'm going to start at verse 11, and we're going to go to 16. "Then their border went up to the west into Maralah. It then touched Dabasheth and reached to the brook that is before Jokneam. Then it turned from Sarid to the east toward the sunrise as far as the border of Chislotabor, and it proceeded to Daberath and up to Japhia. From there it continued eastward toward the sunrise to Gath-Hefer, to Eth-Kazin, and it proceeded to Rimmon, which stretches to Nea. The border circled around it on the north to Hanathon, and it ended at the valley of Iftahel. It included also were Katah and Nahalal and Shimron and Idala and Bethlehem, 12 cities with their villages. This was the inheritance of the sons of Zebulun according to their families, these cities with their villages." Okay, so that's the territory. We've outlined the territory. And as we have done in the past, what we're going to do is we're going to kind of trace Zebulun throughout the Old Testament and maybe into the New Testament and see what we can find about this tribe and maybe what they mean in the big picture. So we are going to start in Genesis chapter 30. So we've had Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And Jacob has gotten his wives. Remember, he had to marry Leah first and then Rachel. And he has had children through these women, and I got to tell my son, Matthew, shh, sorry. Hopefully that's the first and only time. So Leah is kind of Jacob's first wife, but she's kind of the unwanted wife. She's the one he had to marry, the older sister, before he could marry who he really fell in love with, who he really loved, which was Rachel. And so she kind of had this thing going where she wanted to belong, she wanted to be loved by Jacob and accepted, but she wasn't as much as Rachel, right, her sister. And so we have here where Leah is having 6 boys. And Leah conceived again and bore a 6th son to Jacob. Then Leah said, God has endowed me with a good gift. Finally, my husband will acknowledge me as his wife because I have borne him 6 sons. So she named him Zebulun. So she says, finally, I've given Jacob 6 sons. And with this last son, finally, my husband will acknowledge me and love me and treat me equally as my sister. So that's kind of where Zebulun falls. He's the youngest son in a big, big, big family. He's not the youngest son of Jacob, but he's the youngest son of Leah, and he has 5 brothers, and he's kind of in the midst of this big family. He could kind of be just, there's Zebulun on the side, like kind of a forgotten member of the family. And as we go through this, we're going to talk about realities in our lives. Things that we might be, things that we might feel. And the first thing is, Zebulun is last born, and in this culture, that meant insignificant. Like the culture, obviously, the main emphasis was on the firstborn, and the further away you got from that, the more insignificant you were. And he was the last born, so he could have been forgotten. He could have been insignificant. So if you are, maybe you're not I'm the last born, maybe you're not the last born, but maybe you're part of a big family and you feel kind of forgotten, you feel kind of left behind sometimes. Well, God sees you. God sees you, and we're going to see the reality here for Zebulun, that God sees him and his tribe as well. But if we go on a couple chapters in Genesis 33, we see if Leah's plan, if this 6th son finally got the respect that she wanted from Jacob. Then Jacob raised his eyes and looked, and behold, Esau was coming, and 400 men with him. So Esau is his brother who he stole his inheritance. He tricked him into giving him his inheritance, and he thinks Esau, he's going to be so mad when I see him. I don't know what he's going to do to me, but I'm nervous. So Jacob is very nervous that Esau will attack him and his people will attack him. So he divided the children among Leah and Rachel and the 2 slave women. He put the slave women and their children in front. Remember, neither of the sisters could conceive, so they gave over their servant women to have children for Jacob in their stead. So he puts them in the front, and Leah and her children next, and Rachel and Joseph, the beloved child, last. But he himself passed on ahead of them and bowed down to the ground 7 times until he came near his brother. Now that story has a happy ending, right? Esau, happy to see his brother, and they make peace. But if you'll notice, Leah is put in front of Rachel, which shows that Jacob, she has not earned the same love and protection of Jacob that Rachel has. She's still in front of her, which means she'll be attacked first before Rachel, right? So it seems that her plan might not have worked as much as she had hoped. Even though she gave Jacob 6 sons, she gave Jacob the 6th son, Zebulun. So in this respect, you could say that Zebulun was a bit of a disappointment. That Zebulun, there were great plans. His mother had great plans for him, but he was a little bit of a disappointment. What her plans, what her dreams for him didn't come to fruition. And a lot of us might be able to identify with that. You know, our parents, our boss, whoever had these great expectations for us, you know, maybe when we were younger, but we maybe never met up to those, lived up to those. Maybe we consider ourselves a disappointment? Well, God sees you. God sees you. God sees Zebulun. God sees Leah. And God sees you. Even if you feel like you're a disappointment, we'll see that God will use you, just like he did Zebulun. And even if you do feel like a disappointment, even if there were big plans for you and you messed it up somehow, you weren't capable of living up to that, and you feel even like you're doing some mundane thing that is meaningless, maybe that's what's causing you to feel like a disappointment. I was thinking, and I thought of the example of Brother Lawrence. I don't know if you know who this is, but he's like a 15th century French monk. And what he did is for his whole life, he just washed dishes. That's what his job was. His whole entire life, he was washing dishes. But he wrote these amazing works, practicing the presence of God, or the practice of the presence of God. And he talked about how God's presence was with him, and everything he did, washing those dishes, he did for the glory of God. And he wrote this amazing work that people still read devotionally today, and he could find meaning in God's purpose, even in the mundane things of washing the dishes every day at the place that he lived, at his monastery. So even if you're in that role, you can find God's purpose and God's presence in those things. So we go on a little bit to Deuteronomy 33. So this is Moses's kind of prophecy blessing over the different tribes of Israel. And we've looked at this with some of the other tribes. And here's Zebulun's blessing, Deuteronomy 33, verse 18. Of Zebulun, he said, "Rejoice, Zebulun, in your going out, and Issachar in your tents. They will call peoples to the mountain. There they will offer righteous sacrifices, for they will draw out the abundance of the seas and the hidden treasures of the sand." So the first thing I want you to notice is he says, rejoice. So this is a positive message. This is a positive blessing, a positive prophecy. Rejoice. This tribe, well, these two tribes here actually, will have reason to rejoice. And why? He says, because they will offer righteous sacrifices. They will offer righteous sacrifices, not wicked sacrifices. And what are those righteous sacrifices that God desires? We'll come back to it. And they will also draw out the abundance of the seas. What does that make you think of? Fishing, right? Maybe fishermen. Maybe we'll see this later as well as we get into the New Testament. So we're going to put a pin in this, but I want you to keep this in your mind that this was Moses' prophecy over this tribe. So now we're going to get into some of the judges, where we have some people oppressing the people of Israel because they've turned away from the Lord, and God raises up these judges to fight against these different groups of people, to free his people and free them from bondage. So the first instance we have here is Judges chapter 4. Now this is where the king of the Canaanites, and his name is Jabin, his army of 900 iron chariots is oppressing the people of Israel, and Sisera is his commander. And God raises up the judge, Deborah, and he says, the armies of Israel need to go and fight against this person and be free. So she calls the commander of Israel's army, Barak, and he comes forward to do war against them. And it says, Barak summoned Zebulun and Naphtali to Kadesh, and 10,000 men went up with him. Deborah also went up with him. So it seems that Zebulun was one of the only two tribes that responded to this call to come and fight with Deborah and Barak. And then we read in Judges chapter 5 that Zebulun was a people who risked their lives for the army, for Israel's freedom. And they did. They defeated Sisera and Jabin's army, and they freed Israel from their bondage. And this verse in Judges chapter 5 comes in between where they list all these tribes and how they didn't show up and how they didn't come and help. And then they said Zebulun was a people who risked their lives. So Zebulun was there to support his brothers, there to support the other tribes. And we see this a lot of times, Zebulun there in support. So in Judges chapter 6, we have Gideon, and you know the story of Gideon probably, how the Midianites now were oppressing the people of Israel, and God raised up the judge Gideon, and he's to collect an army. And in verse 35, he sent messengers to Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali, and they came up to meet them. So it seems that Zebulun is a part of Gideon's army, and when we think of Gideon's army, you know, they're lapping up water and they're breaking clay pots, and they end up, this little number of men end up defeating this great army of the Midianites and again, freeing Israel from their bondage. And again, Zebulun was a support, was a part, had a role in that battle, in that plan. And then finally we come to 1 Chronicles chapter 12, further on in the Old Testament, and this is where Saul, King Saul, has just died in battle. And he was king of Israel. He was the first king of Israel. And now there's a bit of a question, what's going to happen now? And many of the people of Israel go to Hebron to anoint David, to crown David as king of Israel. So he's going to be the new king of Israel. And we read, and it lists all the tribes and how many soldiers came to support David and to join his army as the new king. And it says, from Zebulun there were 50,000 who went out in the army, who could draw up in battle formation with all kinds of weapons of war and help David with an undivided heart. When you read that list of tribes, that's by far the most of any tribe, the most warriors, the biggest army that comes in support of David from Zebulun. So again, this shows that Zebulun is there to support, is kind of always in the background, giving aid, giving support to Israel, to the tribes of Israel. So maybe you are background support. Zebulun's not really ever, as far as we've read, in the forefront. There aren't any kings, any princes. There's one judge that's kind of barely mentioned from Zebulun, but he's background support. He's back there helping out, keeping things together, supplying troops. And maybe that's how you feel sometimes. Maybe that's what you are, your background support at your job, in your greater family. My old job, before I did this teaching job, I was kind of in a support role. And we had a lot of leadership change. Leaders would come and leaders would go. And I would kind of always be there to support and to help and to make their lives and their jobs as easy as possible and as successful as possible. And, after a while, that can kind of get a little bit old, especially as leaders come and go. But what I had to do is understand this, and what I had to see is understand it. I had to see this truth that even if you're in background support, God sees you. And what I did is I had to focus on the people I was helping, the kids I was telling about Jesus, the different things I was doing, that God was still using me in mighty ways, even though I was background support. So maybe at your job, maybe in your family, maybe wherever, you feel like, I'm never recognized. I'm just back here kind of doing my thing so someone else can get recognized, so they can, have wonderful accolades and be successful. And I'm just back here doing my thing. Well, God sees you. God sees you doing even that. Just like he saw Zebulun supporting his brothers in the tribe. And then we come to Isaiah. So Isaiah chapter 8, God has bad news for Israel. Israel has turned away from him. They have committed adultery on God. And God tells them that judgment is coming. And Isaiah chapter 8, he's talking to the people of Israel, and he says, starting in verse 3, so I approached the prophetess, and she conceived, and this is Isaiah talking, and gave birth to a son. Then the Lord said to me, name him Maher-Shalal-Hashbaz, for before the boy knows how to cry out, my father or my mother, the wealth of Damascus and the spoils of Samaria, also known as the northern kingdom of Israel, will be carried away before the king of Assyria. He's talking about the exile, that the king of Assyria is going to come and destroy the place and take everything away. And he goes on, again, the Lord spoke to me further, saying, inasmuch as these people have rejected the gently flowing waters of Shiloah and rejoice in Rezin and the son of Remaliah. This is saying that they've rejected God, that they've rejected God's providence and God's provision and turned to this northern alliance of Aram and now he's talking to Judah, the king of Israel, and basically put their faith in people and not in God. He's saying, now therefore, behold, the Lord is about to bring on them the strong, abundant waters of the Euphrates River. That is the king of Assyria and all his glory, and it will rise over all its channels and go over all its banks. He's telling them that they're going to be destroyed by Assyria and taken away. So this is the crisis point in Israel. This is the crisis point in Israel's history. The darkest days are coming. But in this moment, he has news, and it has to do with Zebulun. And you've heard this before, certainly, Isaiah 9. But there will be no more gloom for her who was in anguish. In earlier times, he treated the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali with contempt. When the king of Assyria came into Israel, he came from the north, and he would have, the land of Zebulun would have been one of the first tribes that he would have hit, and they would have faced the brunt of the attack of the king of Assyria. That's why God's saying that he treated them with contempt. They received some of the worst judgment. But later on, he will make it glorious. By the way of the sea on the other side of the Jordan, Galilee of the Gentiles. Have you heard of Galilee before? Yeah, he's prophesying that somehow this area will be lifted up and made glorious, Galilee of the Gentiles. Well, Galilee is right there on top of the land of Zebulun. And then he goes on to say, and this is the part that we've heard probably a lot, verse 2, the people who walk in darkness will see a great light. Those who live in a dark land, the light will shine on them. You will multiply the nation, you will increase their joy, and they will rejoice in your presence as with the joy of harvest, as people rejoice when they divide the spoils. For you will break the yoke of their burden and the staff on their shoulders, the rod of the oppressor, as at the battle of Midian. Looking back to Gideon, and remember who was a part of that battle. For every boot of the marching warrior in the roar of battle and cloak rolled in blood will be for burning, fuel for the fire. Meaning there will be no more war, there will be no more destruction, and all the things that are coming, those will be burned in the fire. For, and we just talked about this during Christmas time, a child will be born to us, a son will be given to us, and the government will rest on his shoulders, and his name will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Eternal Father, Prince of Peace. There will be no end to the increase of his government or of peace on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and righteousness from then on and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of armies will accomplish this. Let's not go there yet. So he says that Zebulun has been supporting in the background, kind of doing their thing. They took the brunt. They took a huge chunk of the attack from Assyria, but they will be blessed in this amazing way, that they will get to witness, and this is a messianic passage, meaning it's about the coming Messiah, that they will be some of the first to witness the ministry of the Messiah. The Messiah is gonna come out of their land, of their area, to do his ministry. What an amazing blessing and what a privilege for this insignificant tribe. And if we go on, we know how this is fulfilled, right? It's fulfilled with Jesus, Matthew chapter 2. So Joseph got up, took the child and his mother, and came into the land of Israel. Then after being warned by God in a dream, he left for the regions of Galilee and came and settled in a city called Nazareth. So we know Jesus of Nazareth, right? Can you guess what land Nazareth was in? Zebulun. Nazareth was in Zebulun. So we see all the way here in Matthew chapter 2, this prophecy is being fulfilled. We know Jesus was born in Bethlehem, but where did he come out of? Where did his ministry start? Where was the heart of his ministry? Galilee. His family lived in Nazareth. And if you read the early chapters of the Gospels, Nazareth obviously takes a very center stage. So God uses this kind of insignificant tribe in a mighty, amazing, blessed way. And if you think back to Moses' prophecy now, he says that you will offer righteous offering. Well, you will invite people on the mountain to offer righteous offering. What does Jesus allow us to do? Offer that righteous offering, the kind of offerings that God wants. The fruit of the Spirit. Love God, love your neighbor. Not bulls and sheep and goats. And Jesus allows us to do that through his blood. And then it talked about how they would pull the abundance out of the sea, right? Well, who did Jesus mainly do ministry with? Who did he call to be his disciples? Fishermen. A lot of fishermen. And what did he tell all his disciples that they would do? They would be fishers of men, right? And that was his way of telling them they would bring people into the kingdom of God, into a relationship with him. So even there, in his ministry there, we see all the way back to Deuteronomy 33, God's amazing providence and amazing fulfillment of this prophecy he made through Moses. We see the glory of God through this. And it's amazing. So, with Zebulun, if you are lastborn or you feel insignificant, God sees you. If you may feel like a disappointment, God sees you. If you are kind of in the shadows, in the background, and you just support, and you feel like your role isn't that important, but you just do what you do, God sees you. But also there's more, because we saw that God used the tribe of Zebulun in an amazing way. God will use you. God not only sees you, if you're any of these things, but God will use you. God used the tribe of Zebulun to bring about the Messiah's ministry. And God will use you as well. It might be in those mundane things, washing the dishes. And it's a mindset, right? If you open your eyes to see what God can do through even something like that, then God will use you in mighty ways. And he may use you in other ways. It's an understanding of what God does and the fact that all of these things, he will still use you in mighty ways. We were in our Sunday school class this morning. I teach a class at 11 o'clock called Journeys. You should probably all come because it's pretty great. But we're going through the Gospel of Luke, and one of the members of our class talked about how, how C.S. Lewis, actually, he was quoting C.S. Lewis, how he said even kind of the little insignificant things that we do can have eternal consequences, can mean much more in heaven, in eternity. And that I think of the same thing when we think of Zebulun, when we think of these things, how God will use you. Even the small things that we do, even understanding that God sees us and being empowered through that and going through the different things of our lives. Sure, we might feel like a disappointment. We might be background support, but when we know Jesus and trust him and we understand that he will use us, we see even those little things as having eternal consequences. So even if you are insignificant, maybe you feel like that, like the tribe of Zebulun. Probably many of us have never even thought about the tribe of Zebulun. God sees you, and God will absolutely use you. Would you pray with me? Lord, thank you so much for your amazing providence, and that we can see even the glory of Jesus in Moses' prophecy, his blessing over this kind of insignificant tribe, Lord, this tribe that was last born, and the hopes of his mother was on his shoulders, and those hopes were kind of dashed. We thank you that even that situation can be redeemed and you can love us and you see us and you will use us in mighty ways. Even if they don't seem mighty, they are mighty because they're part of your plan. I pray anyone in here who might have identified with Zebulun in any way, that you would empower them and you would help them to understand how important they are to you and to your plan and to your glory that you're continually bringing. So be with us, Lord, tonight, and be with any among us who aren't here because they have any illness or they're traveling. Keep them safe, keep them healthy. And we pray we'll all see each other again next week, if not sooner. In your name we pray, amen.